What if the darkest secret of the criminal underworld was uncovered by someone the world refused to look at? This is the unbelievable true account of a housekeeper who opened the wrong door, found a missing crime lord in chains, and triggered a bloodbath. You won't believe how it ends. Gwendolyn Harper was invisible. It was a fact of life she had come to accept, and in many ways she relied on it. At 280 pounds, standing barely 5'4", Gwen occupied a significant amount of physical space, yet the wealthy elite of Tuxedo Park, New York, looked right through her. To them, she was merely a grey polyblend uniform, a pair of scrubbing hands, and a mop of ash-blonde hair, pulled back into a severe utilitarian bun. For 3 years, Gwen had worked as a live-in maid at the sprawling fortress-like estate of Victor Gallagher, a billionaire real estate developer with cold eyes and a vicious temper. The Gallagher mansion, known locally as the Ironwoods, was an architectural monolith of dark stone wrought iron and sweeping mahogany staircases. It was a house that demanded perfection, populated by size-zero socialites, ruthless businessmen, and private security guards who looked like mercenaries. Among them, Gwen was a ghost. When she entered a room to dust the chandeliers or polish the imported Italian marble, conversations didn't stop. They simply flowed over her head, as if she were a piece of furniture. Gwen knew she was fat. She felt it in the ache of her knees after a 14-hour shift, in the chafing of her thighs beneath her uniform, and in the condescending, pitying glances from the head housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins. But Gwen's size was also her armor. It allowed her to blend into the wallpaper, to observe and to listen. And at the Ironwoods there was always something to hear. She knew which politicians Victor Gallagher was bribing. She knew about the illegal offshore accounts, but none of that prepared her for the cellar. It was a torrential Tuesday night in late October. A massive squall had blown off the Hudson River, thrashing the ancient oak trees against the mansion's windows. Upstairs, Victor Gallagher was hosting a high-stakes poker game for 5 men Gwen had never seen before, men with heavy Eastern European accents, tailored suits and bulges under their jackets that were unmistakably firearms. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating electric with a violent tension. Around midnight, Mrs. Higgins found Gwen in the industrial kitchen, scrubbing down the 8-burner Viking stove. "Harper." Mrs. Higgins barked, her thin lips pursed in perpetual disapproval. "Mr. Gallagher requires 3 bottles of the 1982 Chateau Margaux. It's in the sub-cellar past the prohibition storage. Go down and fetch them, and be quick about it. You're moving slower than molasses tonight." Gwen swallowed her exhaustion, wiped her damp forehead with the back of her sleeve, and nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Higgins." The sub-cellar was a place none of the staff liked to go. Built in the 1920s during the height of Prohibition, it was a labyrinth of damp stone corridors, flickering incandescent bulbs and heavy oak doors. To get there, Gwen had to take the service elevator down 2 floors below ground level. When the metal grates slid open, the air hit her like a wet towel, cold, smelling of mildew, ancient dust, and something else. Something sharp and metallic, like pennies, like blood. Her heavy rubber-soled shoes squeaked against the polished concrete as she navigated the maze of wine racks. The shadows stretched long and menacing against the vaulted ceilings. She found the French Bordeaux section and carefully extracted 3 dust-covered bottles of the Margaux, cradling them against her heavy chest. She was turning to leave when she heard it. Clink. Thud. Gwen froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, loud in the suffocating silence of the cellar. She held her breath, straining to listen. Clink. Rattle. Thud. It wasn't a rat. It was heavy, rhythmic. It sounded like a thick iron chain being dragged across a stone floor. Gwen's knuckles turned white around the necks of the wine bottles. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to get on the elevator and go back to the bright, warm kitchen. But a strange magnetic curiosity anchored her feet to the floor. The sound was coming from behind a massive, floor-to-ceiling wine rack against the far eastern wall, a rack Gwen knew held nothing but empty decorative casks. Setting the wine bottles down on a wooden tasting barrel, Gwen approached the rack. She noticed something she had never seen before, fresh scuff marks on the concrete floor, tracing a semicircle beneath the bottom of the shelf. It wasn't just a shelf. It was a door. With trembling hands, she pressed her weight against the wooden frame. At first it didn't budge. Gritting her teeth, she threw her shoulder into it, using her mass to her advantage. With a heavy grinding groan, the entire wine rack swung outward on hidden steel hinges, revealing a pitch-black corridor carved directly into the bedrock. The metallic smell of blood was overpowering now. A faint amber glow leaked from the end of the narrow tunnel. Gwen crept forward, her breath catching in her throat. At the end of the corridor was a reinforced steel door with a sliding viewing panel. The panel was cracked open. Gwen pressed her face to the cold metal and peered inside. What she saw made her blood run ice cold. The room was a bare concrete cell, illuminated by a single harsh halogen bulb, protected by a wire cage. In the center of the room, anchored to a thick cast-iron pipe running from the floor to the ceiling, was a man. He was stripped to the waist, his torso a road map of vivid, purple bruising, deep lacerations and dark tribal tattoos. His wrists were bound above his head in heavy, industrial-grade steel shackles. His head hung low, obscured by a mat of filthy, sweat-soaked black hair. The floor around him was stained a rusty brown. Gwen gasped a sharp, involuntary intake of air. Instantly the man's head snapped up. Even battered and bloodied, the sheer predatory intensity in his eyes made Gwen take a step back. They were dark, dangerous eyes, the eyes of a cornered wolf. She recognized him instantly, and a cold wave of absolute terror washed over her. It was Lorenzo Moretti. Gwen watched the true crime documentaries. She read the tabloids. Everyone in the tri-state area knew that face. Lorenzo Moretti was the ruthless, 34-year-old boss of the Moretti crime syndicate. 3 weeks ago, the news had reported a massive shootout at a Hoboken shipping yard. The media claimed Moretti had fled the country to Sicily to avoid federal indictment. He hadn't fled. Victor Gallagher had him chained like a dog beneath his mansion. "Who's there?" Lorenzo's voice was a gravelly, dehydrated rasp, barely louder than a whisper, but it carried a terrifying authority. "If Victor sent you to finish it, get in here and do it, you coward!" Gwen couldn't speak. She was paralyzed. Lorenzo squinted against the harsh light, his eyes locking onto the small viewing slit. He didn't see a hitman. He saw a wide, terrified blue eye and a lock of ash-blonde hair. "A woman!" he rasped, coughing weakly. He strained against the chains, the metal biting into his bloody wrists. "Who are you? Open the door." Gwen backed away, her hands flying to her mouth. She turned and ran. She ran back through the tunnel, pushed the wine rack closed, grabbed the 3 bottles of Margot, and fled to the service elevator. As the doors closed, her reflection stared back at her from the polished metal, a heavy, trembling, invisible maid who had just stumbled into a war she could not possibly survive. For the next 48 hours, Gwen lived in a state of hypervigilance. Every time Victor Gallagher walked into a room, his expensive leather shoes clicking on the marble, Gwen expected him to pull a gun and shoot her. She expected him to know. But Victor didn't look at her. Nobody did. She served the caviar, she scrubbed the grout, and she remained entirely invisible. But she couldn't stop thinking about the cellar. She couldn't stop thinking about Lorenzo Moretti's eyes. The news on the kitchen television murmured in the background as the staff prepared lunch. A sharply dressed reporter was standing outside a federal courthouse in Manhattan. Authorities are still searching for Lorenzo Moretti, who has now been missing for 24 days. Rumors of his assassination by a rival cartel continue to circulate. He wasn't in Manhattan. He was rotting 60 feet below them, dying of thirst. That night, when the house finally settled into an uneasy sleep and the security guards were doing their perimeter rotations outside, Gwen made a decision. It was incredibly stupid, practically suicidal, but she couldn't let a human being die like an animal in the dark. She packed a small canvas tote bag, 3 bottles of purified water, leftover roasted chicken from the evening's dinner, a clean, damp towel, and a small first aid kit she stole from Mrs. Higgins's office. She timed her descent perfectly, avoiding the rotating gaze of the hallway cameras. When she reached the sub-cellar, the silence was deafening. She pushed open the hidden wine rack and crept down the bedrock tunnel. When she reached the steel door, she found it unlocked. Victor's men had been sloppy, perhaps believing a locked tunnel was enough. Gwen gripped the heavy iron handle, her heart threatening to beat its way out of her chest, and pulled the door open. The stench of sweat, blood, and infection hit her like a physical blow. Lorenzo was slumped against the pipe, unconscious. His breathing was shallow and ragged. Gwen stepped into the cell, dropping the tote bag. "Mr. Moretti," she whispered, her voice trembling. His eyes fluttered open. For a second there was wild confusion, followed instantly by a hardened, predatory glare. He tracked her movements as she slowly knelt just out of his reach. He looked at her uniform, at her sturdy, heavy frame, and at the canvas bag. "You came back," he croaked, his lips cracked and bleeding. "The maid." "I brought you water," Gwen said, her voice shaking. She unscrewed the cap and cautiously stepped closer. She held the bottle to his lips. Lorenzo drank, greedily choking, as the water hit his parched throat, but he didn't pull away. When the bottle was empty, he leaned his head back against the cold iron pipe, panting. He stared at her. Really looked at her in a way no one in this house ever had. He didn't look at her body with disgust or dismissal. He looked at her with calculation. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Gwen." "Gwen," he repeated, tasting the syllable. "Do you know who I am?" "Gwen." "Yes," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "You're Lorenzo Moretti. You're a mobster." A dark, humorless chuckle escaped him, ending in a wince of pain. "I'm a businessman who made a bad deal. Gallagher wants my shipping routes. He thought he could break me down here, make me sign over the LLCs before he puts a bullet in my head." He pulled against the chains, his muscles straining under the bruised skin. "How long have I been down here?" "Over 3 weeks," Gwen said. She pulled the roasted chicken from the bag. She had to feed him small pieces, her thick, soft fingers brushing against his stubbled jaw. The intimacy of the act made her face flush hotly. She was a heavy girl who had never had a boyfriend, never been touched with anything but indifference. And here she was, hand-feeding the most dangerous man on the East Coast. "Why are you doing this?" Lorenzo asked, chewing slowly, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Gallagher catches you in here, he'll skin you alive." "I couldn't just leave you to die," Gwen muttered, pulling out the damp towel to wipe the dried blood from his face. "I'm not like them upstairs." "No," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming smooth and dangerously hypnotic. "You're not. They treat you like dirt, don't they, Gwen? I've seen men like Gallagher. I know how they run their houses. You're the invisible girl, the one who cleans up their messes while they pretend you don't exist." Gwen froze the towel hovering over a cut on his cheek. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes. He had read her entire existence in 3 minutes. "You don't know anything about me," she said defensively, her face burning. "I know that a beautiful woman with a kind heart shouldn't be scrubbing floors for a snake like Victor," Lorenzo said softly. Gwen scoffed, stepping back, her insecurities flaring up like a shield. "Don't play games with me. I'm not stupid, and I'm not beautiful. I'm the fat maid. You're just saying whatever you have to say, so I'll help you." Lorenzo's expression hardened, but not with anger. It was fierce, intense sincerity. "In my world, Gwen, we don't judge a woman by the bones poking through her skin. We judge her by her loyalty and her fire. You had the courage to walk into this cell. That makes you the most beautiful thing I've seen in a month. Now are you going to help me get out of these chains, or are we going to sit here and argue about your waistline?" Gwen's breath hitched. A strange, unfamiliar thrill shot through her stomach. For the first time in her life, she felt powerful. She wasn't just Gwen the maid. She was the keeper of the keys. Over the next 4 nights, a dangerous routine developed. While the Ironwood slept, Gwen sneaked into the sub-cellar. She brought him antibiotics, warm food and water. She cleaned his wounds. And in the quiet, suffocating darkness of that cell, Lorenzo talked to her. He didn't treat her like a servant. He asked about her life, her dreams. He told her stories of growing up in the streets of Palermo, of the empire he built. He promised her that if she helped him escape, she would never have to wash another dish or bow her head to another socialite for the rest of her life. She was falling in love with a monster, and she knew it. But the monster was the only one who treated her like a queen. On the 5th night, everything went wrong. Gwen was in the kitchen preparing her tote bag when the heavy oak doors swung open. Victor Gallagher walked in, flanked by 2 of his massive security guards. Victor was holding a small black electronic device that was blinking rapidly. Gwen froze her hand, hovering over a loaf of bread. "It's funny," Victor said, his voice smooth and cold as ice. He walked over to the kitchen island, his eyes finally truly locking onto Gwen. "The perimeter sensors haven't been tripped. No one has gone in or out of the sub-cellar, and yet when we reviewed the backup server for the camera feeds today, there was a strange 10-minute loop in the footage outside the Prohibition wing, every night at 2 a.m. Gwen's blood turned to lead. Victor leaned over the marble counter, staring at the tote bag in her hand, then up at her terrified, pale face. A cruel, twisted smile spread across his lips. "Well, well," Victor purred, drawing a suppressed silver pistol from his jacket. "It seems the fat little mouse has been feeding the snake." Victor's cold laugh echoed against the stainless steel appliances. He pressed the cold barrel of the suppressed pistol directly against Gwen's forehead. The metal was freezing. Her heavy chest heaved her breath, coming in short, terrified gasps. The 2 massive security guards, men with thick necks and cruel smiles, chuckled from the doorway. "I have to admit," Victor sneered, his finger tapping a rhythm on the trigger guard, "I never expected it to be you, Harper. I thought perhaps Higgins had grown a conscience. But the invisible maid, the fat girl playing nurse to the city's biggest monster, it's almost poetic. Grab her." He barked at the guards. "Drag her down to the cellar. I want Moretti to watch her bleed out before I put a bullet in his skull." One of the guards stepped forward, his massive hand reaching for her collar. In that fraction of a second, something snapped inside Gwen. For 26 years, she had made herself small. She had swallowed insults, accepted her invisibility, and let people like Victor Gallagher dictate her worth. But looking at the malicious gleam in Victor's eyes, she realized she was going to die. And she refused to die, as the pathetic, frightened maid on the kitchen floor. Gwen didn't shrink away. Instead, she leaned into her weight. As the guard's hand grasped her uniform, she pivoted, throwing her entire 280 pounds into his center of gravity. The sudden immense shift caught the hulking man completely off guard. He slipped on the polished marble floor, his boots scrambling for purchase. With a feral scream, Gwen grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet resting on the stove, the one she had just used to sear a steak for Victor's late dinner, and swung it with every ounce of terrifying, desperate strength she possessed. The heavy iron connected with the side of the guard's head with a sickening, hollow crack. He dropped instantly unconscious before his face hit the tiles. Victor shouted in shock, raising his pistol, but the distraction was all Gwen needed. She snatched the pot of boiling water from the adjacent burner, screaming as the scalding liquid splashed over her own wrist and hurled it directly at Victor and the second guard. The blistering water caught Victor squarely in the chest and face. He shrieked a high-pitched sound of pure agony, blindly firing the suppressed pistol. Thwip, thwip, thwip. Bullets shattered the kitchen windows and embedded into the oak cabinetry. The second guard wiped scalding water from his eyes, drawing his own weapon, but Gwen was already moving. She wasn't fast, but she was driven by pure, unadulterated adrenaline. She threw her heavy frame forward, tackling the blinded Victor to the ground. The billionaire struggled, but Gwen pinned him beneath her sheer mass, her knees pressing into his ribs until she heard a sharp crack. She ripped the keys from his belt, grabbed the fallen guard's heavy Glock from the floor, and scrambled to her feet. "You're dead, Harper!" Victor screamed, his face an angry, blistering red as he thrashed on the floor. "There are 20 men outside. You'll never make it out of this house." Gwen didn't look back. She sprinted down the hallway, her thick rubber soles slapping the marble heading straight for the service elevator. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her lungs burning, but she didn't stop. She hit the subcellar button, her bloody, trembling hands gripping the heavy firearm. She had never held a gun before in her life. The elevator descended, plunging her back into the damp, metallic-smelling darkness. She burst out of the metal grates, tearing through the labyrinth of wine racks. She shoved the hidden door open, ignoring the tearing pain in her bruised shoulder, and ran down the bedrock tunnel. When she reached the steel door, she frantically jammed Victor's master key into the lock. It clicked. She threw the heavy door open. Lorenzo was still chained to the pipe, his head slumped forward. But at the sound of the door slamming against the concrete wall, his eyes snapped open. He saw Gwen panting, covered in sweat and blood, holding a Glock in her shaking hands. "Gwen!" He breathed, his voice laced with shock. "What did you do? I'm getting you out!" She gasped, rushing forward with the key ring. She found the small, heavy iron key and jammed it into the shackles around his left wrist. The lock disengaged with a heavy clunk. Lorenzo slumped forward, catching himself on his freed arm. He let out a ragged groan, rubbing the raw, bloody skin of his wrist. Gwen quickly unlocked his right hand. He was free. "Victor knows!" Gwen cried, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I hurt him. I hurt his guards. They're coming down here right now. He said there are 20 men." Lorenzo didn't panic. He didn't rush. The moment the chains fell away, a terrifying transformation occurred. The battered, starving prisoner vanished. In his place stood the ruthless boss of the Moretti Syndicate. Despite his bruises, despite his weakness, he radiated an aura of pure, lethal dominance. He reached out and gently took the heavy gun from her trembling hands. His fingers brushed against hers, warm and rough. "You fought for me," Lorenzo whispered, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, possessive intensity. "You took down Victor Gallagher's men to save me." "We're going to die down here," Gwen sobbed. "No, we are not," Lorenzo said, checking the magazine of the Glock. He grabbed her hand, his grip unyielding. "You showed me your fire, Gwen. Now I'm going to show you mine. Stay exactly behind me." They moved back into the tunnel, the silence of the sub-cellar now broken by the heavy thud of combat boots echoing from the elevator shaft above. Victor's men were descending. Lorenzo moved through the shadows of the wine cellar like a ghost pulling Gwen along. Despite his emaciated state, his instincts were razor-sharp. He didn't head for the elevator. He led her toward the forgotten, bricked-up Prohibition era, smuggling tunnels at the far south end of the basement. "There's no way out there," Gwen whispered frantically, as flashlight beams swept through the darkness behind them. "It's sealed shut." "Nothing is sealed if you know where the mortar is weak," Lorenzo replied softly. They reached the damp brick wall, just as a voice shouted from the corridors behind them. "Check the Bordeaux racks, he can't get far." Lorenzo pressed his hands against the masonry, feeling the edges of the bricks. He found what he was looking for, a heavy iron latch concealed behind a crumbling facade. He pulled it, and a section of the wall swung silently outward, revealing a narrow earthen tunnel that smelled of the river. "Go," he commanded, shoving Gwen inside before slipping in behind her and pulling the fake wall shut, just as flashlight beams hit the area they had just occupied. They navigated the claustrophobic tunnel for what felt like hours. Gwen's heavy breathing echoed in the tight space, her muscles screaming in agony. She was exhausted, terrified, and running on pure adrenaline. Lorenzo kept a protective hand on her back, guiding her forward through the darkness. Finally, the tunnel ended at a rusted iron grate covered in ivy. Lorenzo kicked it open, and the cold, stinging rain of the storm washed over them. They emerged into the thick woods, bordering the Hudson River, miles away from the Gallagher estate. Lorenzo leaned against a tree, coughing violently, dropping the gun to the mud. The adrenaline was wearing off, and his battered body was failing him. Gwen rushed to his side, wrapping her thick, warm arms around his shivering torso, holding him up. "I've got you," she whispered fiercely. "I've got you." He looked up at her, rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. "My jacket pocket," he rasped. "There's a burner phone. Gallagher didn't know about it. Call the only contact in it." Gwen fished the small plastic phone from his ruined trousers. She hit dial and held it to her ear. A man answered on the first ring. "Where is he?" the voice demanded, rough and frantic. "We are in the woods by the river, south of the Ironwoods estate." Gwen said, her voice remarkably steady. "Come get your boss." Within 20 minutes, 3 black SUVs tore through the muddy access road, headlights cutting through the torrential rain. Heavily armed men poured out their faces, pale with shock when they saw Lorenzo battered and bleeding, leaning against a large, soaking wet woman in a maid's uniform. "Boss," the lead man breathed, rushing forward. "We thought you were dead. We tore the city apart." "Get us in the car, Leo," Lorenzo ordered, his voice weak but commanding. "And send a team to the Gallagher estate. I want Victor Gallagher dragged out of his house by his throat. Tonight." The aftermath was swift and merciless. By dawn, Victor Gallagher's empire was in ashes. The Moretti Syndicate stormed the Ironwoods, overpowering the remaining guards. Victor, still suffering from severe burns, was taken away in the trunk of a black sedan, never to be seen again. The police, heavily on Lorenzo's payroll, looked the other way, reporting the incident as a violent home invasion orchestrated by an unknown cartel. As for Gwen, her life as the invisible Fat Maid ended the moment she stepped into that SUV. 6 months later, the socialites of Tuxedo Park were buzzing with a new scandal. Lorenzo Moretti, the infamous crime lord who had mysteriously vanished and returned more powerful than ever, had taken a wife. The rumors were wild and incredulous. They said she wasn't a supermodel. They said she wasn't a Russian heiress or an Italian aristocrat. They said she was big. Gwendolyn Moretti stood on the balcony of Lorenzo's sprawling penthouse overlooking Manhattan. She wore a stunning, custom-tailored emerald silk gown that draped flawlessly over her heavy curves, accentuating her figure rather than hiding it. Her ash-blonde hair fell in soft, elegant waves down her back. Diamonds rested against her collarbone. She looked down at the glittering city below, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. She was no longer invisible. She was feared, respected, and deeply, fiercely loved. The sliding glass door opened, and Lorenzo stepped out into the cool night air. He wore a sharp black suit, his scars hidden beneath the expensive fabric, though the dangerous glint in his dark eyes remained. He walked up behind Gwen, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about, Mia Regina?" he murmured, kissing the side of her neck. "I was just thinking about Mrs. Higgins." Gwen smiled, a slow, wicked curve of her lips. "I heard she lost her job when the Ironwoods was foreclosed upon. Such a shame." Lorenzo chuckled, his chest vibrating against her back. "I can have a word with her new employers if you like. Ensure she ends up scrubbing basement floors for the rest of her miserable life." Gwen turned in his arms, looking up into the eyes of the monster she had saved. She reached up gently, tracing the faint scar on his jawline. She was the only person in the world who could touch him this way. "No," Gwen said softly, her blue eyes flashing with a dark, newfound power. "Let her be invisible. It's what she deserves." Lorenzo smiled, leaning down to capture her lips in a deep, intoxicating kiss. He had built his empire on fear, but he had given the keys to the kingdom to the woman who possessed the fiercest heart he had ever known. Gwendolyn Harper had spent her entire life hiding in the shadows of the elite, but in the arms of the underworld's most dangerous king, the fat maid had finally stepped into the light, and she was never going back to the dark again. What an absolutely wild ride. That is the insane, true story of how one woman's immense bravery turned her from an invisible housekeeper into the undisputed queen of the underworld. Would you have risked it all to save him? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you couldn't get enough of this thrilling Mafia romance drama, please smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable, shocking stories.